Everybody, Virginia Summy here, and today we are coming to you with Dr. Clayton Butler. Clayton is the postdoctoral fellow at the Nau Center for Civil War History at the University of Virginia. He got his PhD from the University of Virginia, and his new book, brand new book, True Blue, White Unionists in the Deep South During the Civil War and Reconstruction, has just been released by LSU Press. And so Clayton is going to tell us about his book and about some of these Unionists in the Deep South. So Clayton, thank you for joining us. And if you can, tell our viewers a little bit about your book.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Of course, really appreciate the opportunity to chat about my book and my research. My book came out of my dissertation, which I defended about 2 years ago now here at UVA. And it was about, as the title I think indicates, white Unionists in the Deep South during the Civil War. I started off with some pretty basic questions. You know, who were they? Why did they take the Unionist stand that they did? How did they do so? How were they perceived in both the North and the South and the Confederacy? And what happened to them as a result? And the way that I approached my research, you know, a lot of dissertation work is about, you know, setting the parameters so you can knowing where to start. And so I decided to look at 3 regiments of Union soldiers recruited from Deep South states, because it can be very difficult to determine national allegiance. It's a very slippery subject. So I figured that volunteering for the Union Army was about as solid an expression of unconditional unionism as one could make during the Civil War era. So I focused on I found the 1st Alabama Cavalry, 1st Louisiana Cavalry, and Bradford's battalion, also known as the 13th Tennessee Cavalry. And these guys are from West Tennessee, which is importantly much more Deep South regionally than the probably better known Unionist contingents of East Tennessee, that West Virginia area. And so what I did was I used these regiments as my jumping off point, you know, to look into who are these guys who enlisted, who were the leaders of these regiments, what was their career like over the course of the war, what were the communities like where these men were drawn from, and then what happened to them as a result. What did they do during Reconstruction? And I found really a lot of interesting stuff when I kept digging. I could tell you about my you know, sort of the most interesting maybe people associated with these regiments, or I don't know if you want to how you want me to sort of guide this, because I could just keep talking.
Yeah, that sounds so interesting, because when I remember I first saw, you know, the subtitle of the book, I thought, oh, I'm guessing I'm originally from Western North Carolina. And so I thought, oh, there'll be like, you know, Western North Carolina, East Tennessee folk in there. So I was really surprised, about to see like Alabama and Louisiana in there. So yeah, if you could tell us some about these people, and you know, what convinced them to, you know, keep their allegiance with the United States, and also you know, what were some of the ramifications of their loyalty?
Yeah, so as with most Unionists, and as with almost, you know, any historical figure at all, really, like getting down to the level of motivation can be very difficult, and there's as many different motivations really as there are people. But in order to generalize, the communities that the 1st Alabama, for example, were drawn from are from typically the northern counties of the state, the upcountry sections of the state that are outside of the Black Belt. Not as heavily slave owning, not as heavily reliant and enmeshed in the slave economy. In many ways, these North Alabamians do resemble politically people more from East Tennessee. They're kind of a bunch of little Andrew Johnsons. These guys, they're Democrats, which becomes a very important in Reconstruction. When we think of Unionists in the South, very often We can assume that they're Whigs, because that happens very much or former Whigs, I should say, because of course that party is defunct by the time the Civil War comes around. But these guys are Democrats. They're Jacksonian Unionists. And Andrew Johnson, who admired Andrew Jackson as well. These guys resemble them politically. And there was a surprising amount of resistance to secession in the northern part of Alabama. The vote, I believe, at the secession convention was 61 in favor, 39 against, which, because of the 6 and the 3, it sort of looks, that's quite a close vote. And a lot of Alabamians did go, once secession passed, they went along with it, and threw in their lot with the Confederacy. But there were a lot of Unionists in Alabama that came from the northern part of the state. And as soon as the Union military comes in down the Tennessee River Valley in 62, they start to show up trying to enlist in the Union Army. And enough of them eventually do show up, especially around Corinth, that they're able to form a regiment out of them. In Louisiana, the initial core of the 1st Louisiana Cavalry comes basically from New Orleans, which again falls to the Union Army in the spring of 1862, very early on. And I remember reading in my research a great book by Richard Current called Lincoln's Loyalists. And he has this great pithy line about how in order to enlist in the Union Army, a Southerner needed access to it. And so that's why the initial contingent of Louisiana Unionists comes from New Orleans, because that's where the Union Army was. And a lot of these guys are German, Irish immigrants, people who, many of them who have come over in the late 1840s, fleeing the political turbulence in Europe, and they have a sort of antipathy towards slavery as an institution. They associate it with old world nobility and aristocracy, and they, I think perhaps more than many native-born white Southerners in the Deep South, have a loyalty to the Union as something they have chosen in a deliberate way. Louisiana Unionists do come out of the woodwork as the Union Army moves through the state, especially in the Red River Campaign. But the core of that regiment is New Orleans, New Orleans residents.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
I'm sorry, go on. Yeah. And in Tennessee?
And in Tennessee, a lot of these guys, they're not a huge number of them. I don't want to exaggerate their prevalence. They're few and far between. But they have in West Tennessee, they really are a more diverse group who resemble their Confederate neighbors in almost every way, except for their Union allegiance. And in these cases, it tends to be more based upon a kinship loyalty. Kinship groups like Fielding Hearst, for example, had a huge group of people who were associated with him. And Bradford, who was the leader of the 13th Tennessee. This is a guy who had known Nathan Bedford Forrest before the war, had been born in the same neighborhood. And this is one of the really kind of grim but fascinating anecdotes I found. Bradford was, and his West Tennessee Unionists were half of the garrison at Fort Pillow. Everybody knows about Fort Pillow. It's probably the single most infamous event of the Civil War in terms of what you would call, fundamentally a war crime, a racial atrocity that Bedford Forrest's Confederates commit against the African American contingent at Fort Pillow, who are trying to surrender and are essentially put to the sword. But half of the garrison at Fort Pillow consists of West Tennessee Unionists, who also suffer at Forrest's hands as race traitors, basically. And this is the language that the Confederates use. And during the fighting at Fort Pillow, the leader of the USCT regiments is killed very early on in the fighting. Lionel Booth is his name. So Bradford becomes the ranking officer in the fort, and it's Bradford who is the ranking officer in the fort when it falls, and he is summarily executed by Bedford Forrest's Confederates after the battle for the crime of being a white officer leading Black troops. This is the sort of, everybody knows that scene in Glory, right? Where he reads out the Confederate have stated their policy that any white officers captured commanding Black troops will be considered as leading a servile insurrection and will be subject to summary execution. Well, this happens to Bradford. And I think in many ways, he is the most prominent case of this happening in the entire Civil War. But because he's not technically the commander of this regiment, he just becomes their de facto commander on the day. It has sort of been lost as in a sort of technical way and overlooked that this is his case. And his case features in the Fort Pillow report, which are, and so I think Bradford is one of those guys who I turned up in my research that I think is a really interesting figure and ought to be better, I think, known in Civil War history circles.
Yeah, no kidding. I was unaware of that story. I mean, I'm not I'm a post 1865 person by trade, but yeah, so that is so it's so interesting. So as far as after the war was over, did a lot of these loyalists, loyal Unionists, loyal Americans, did they stay in their hometowns in Alabama and Louisiana? And what were their lives like afterwards and, interacting with their neighbors who had, joined the Confederacy?
Yeah, it was tense. And in many ways I found over the course of my research, that really the Reconstruction story is in some ways the more interesting story. After the war, Northerners are really, really keen for Southern Unionists to take a leading role in Reconstruction. They are really uncomfortable handing the reins straight back. I mean, Johnson's not, but many Northerners are really not keen to hand the reins back to people who are so recently engaged in trying to destroy the country. They're very uncomfortable with the prospect of handing the reins over to, politically, that is, to recently emancipated former slaves. Of course, emancipation is not something that comes, not emancipation, sorry. The 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment is not something that comes immediately at the end of the war. It comes as a result of events early on in Reconstruction. So many Northerners are looking to these Unionists to play a leading role, and some of them do try, but immediately become swamped by these rapidly rehabilitated former Confederates who basically recreate the situation of the secession winter, where they're starting to intimidate and harass these people because they're completely unrepentant, these Confederates. This is the whole issue in early Reconstruction, giant presidential Reconstruction, that Johnson, gives these former Confederates an inch and they take a mile, and they immediately start to harass these former Unionists again. And essentially what happens is without wanting to initially, these former Unionists realize that the only way that they can protect themselves and live in this situation surrounded by former Confederate neighbors is through Black suffrage, is through political power. And so you have this brief moment when these former Unionists and these formerly enslaved people find themselves in the same political camp. And they elect a lot of former Unionists to very important positions. For example, the colonel of the 1st Alabama Cavalry is George Spencer. He is Alabama's first Republican senator, and he is senator right through Reconstruction. Former Unionist William H. Smith becomes the first Republican governor of Alabama, and he's a guy who was actually with the 1st Alabama Cavalry as a recruiter. He had family members in the regiment, and he actually also accompanied Sherman on his march through Georgia, which another thing that I found very interesting, the 1st Alabama Cavalry was in the vanguard of the March to the Sea. Sherman picked them right at the sort of the front of the line, and they actually became somewhat infamous on the march for the way they treated secessionists, large slaveholders. They're plundering, and many of the sort of things we most associate with the ransacking on Sherman's march was done by these Unionists, and they received an official reprimand for it. So in West Tennessee, in Louisiana, for a captain in the First Louisiana Cavalry ends up, there were several members of the First Louisiana Cavalry actually who were become delegates to the Louisiana State Constitutional Convention. These Unionists do play a very important role in Reconstruction, again, which I think is something that is not particularly appreciated in the literature. In Eric Foner's Reconstruction, for example, he never mentions that Spencer had been the colonel of the 1st Alabama Cavalry. He obviously talks about Spencer at some point, at points as this Alabama Republican senator. He does come up, but the fact that he was the colonel of the 1st Alabama does not, which I think is an incredible omission. It's such an important aspect of how he attained a political foundation in the state. And I think that's seeing the continuity between the wartime exploits and the Reconstruction situation, I think is really important to understanding the politics of the era as a whole. Yeah, definitely. That is. So, do you have any favorite anecdotes from the book? Any favorite loyal Unionists that come up in your? I mean, I have a few. It's not my favorite anecdote, but the Bradford story I think is one that certainly deserves to be better known. Yeah, definitely. Another one that I think is really interesting is a lot of people know that General Sherman was living in Louisiana. He was the superintendent of the military academy that eventually became LSU when the war started. So he was the head of this military academy and had hundreds of cadets, and one of them stayed Unionist. This guy was named Henry Bullard Tolliver. That's Taliaferro is how it's spelled, but it's pronounced Tolliver. And he stayed Unionist. He enlists in the 1st Louisiana Cavalry. His father, James Tolliver, was a delegate to the Louisiana State Secession Convention and submits a formal protest against secession. So here's this Unionist family in Louisiana. They're from Catahoula Parish. They're not New Orleansians or New Orleansites. But Tolliver is a fascinating example of these singular sort of characters who stay loyal to the Union. And Sherman does mention him in his memoirs. Another thing that's mentioned in Sherman's memoirs is George Snelling, who's in the 1st Alabama Cavalry. He's a Georgia Unionist who enlists in the 1st Alabama. And when they're on the march near Milledgeville, a former slave, a formerly enslaved man who is liberated as Sherman, of course, marches up to them, recognizes Snelling from the plantation, from the pre-war. And he says, and he's thrilled to see Snelling dressed in blue, and Snelling requests permission to go lead a raid specifically to his uncle's plantation, and pointedly destroys the cotton gin and ransacks it. And wow. So there's this incredible encounter there. Those are two of my favorites: the Tolliver family and Snelling. There's another interesting instance of a captain in the 1st Louisiana Cavalry who has the great name of Algernon Badger. That's a great. Yeah, Algernon Sidney Badger, and he rises through the ranks of the 1st Louisiana Cavalry, and he settles in New Orleans after the war and becomes a head of the New Orleans Metropolitan Police, which are the people who are in charge essentially of countering the White League in 1874 at the Battle of Liberty Place, when this white supremacist democratic political group essentially takes over the Louisiana state government for a couple of days. It has to be fought by Louisiana's New Orleans Metropolitan Police, another of whose prominent members is James Longstreet. And I found this great letter in his papers at Tulane where he writes to his father, and he's describing the fight at at the Battle of Liberty Place, and he accuses Longstreet of, quote, bad generalship on the day, which I just thought was a little cheeky of him. That was pretty funny.
So did you notice that particularly in these battles in the South, when you have, Southern Unionists fighting against Confederates, and like the anecdote you just shared, were there any like particularly personally, I mean, it sounds like this could have been particularly personally intense, like, I am going to go to your specific plantation and, and destroy the cotton gin. Mm-hmm. Were there more maybe personal vendettas with white or with Southern Unionists, or in any instances of, the inner family?
Yeah, there were. One of the cliches about the Civil War that I remember that many people probably heard growing up, first learning about, is it was a brother versus brother sort of fight, And when you think about it, that really only happened, it had to be a sort of Southern Unionist situation, because that's not happening for families in Vermont or,
right.
And, obviously you've got your border states, Kentucky, Maryland, where that would happen. But you also saw it in these deep South states. One of Tolliver's brothers, Henry Bullard Tolliver, joined, whose name was John Quincy Adams Tolliver, by the way. Yeah, his father was a Whig, and his father named several of his sons after famous Whigs. One of whom, John Quincy Adams Tolliver. You wonder what his reception was like in the Confederate regiment, where he showed up. He says, "Hi, I'm John Quincy Adams Tolliver." But so there's an example right there of a brother literally against a brother, and one on the Union side, one on the Confederate side. I'm not, you can only imagine what that did to the father. But it also speaks to the non-inevitability of this national choice. I mean, if you have brothers going in different directions, there is clearly a choice in the matter. Also in Louisiana, I found evidence. A very prominent Unionist who ends up the governor after the war is James Madison Wells. And he's a sort of Andrew Johnson in Louisiana, where he's a strong Unionist during the war, really uncompromising, but a fundamentally conservative guy. He owned slaves before the war, and he opposed secession on the grounds that it would destroy slavery. He had that conservative anti-secession position. Same with Tolliver. Tolliver also was a slave owner. He said, this is going to backfire. And Wells, when the Red River campaign in '64 goes south, to use a sort of ironic term, for the Union forces, and they're retreating, Wells' house is completely destroyed. And I found letters of a Confederate soldier in the LSU archive saying that they deliberately found his house and burned it for that reason, because he was a known outspoken Unionist. The only thing that didn't get destroyed, I think, was the kitchen building, or the kitchen, because his wife's brother was on Confederate General Richard Taylor's staff. So there's your personal connection there. I have, that's a sort of instance where the personal connection both caused destruction and saved a small portion of it.
Save the kitchen.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we are going to start filming soon on this Civil War documentary that, as a historian, as a Civil War historian, what would you like to see from a new Civil War documentary?
Well, I think the short answer is Unionists, because there's almost no reference to Unionists at all in the original, the PBS. I don't know why I did quotes. It is the original PBS version. There's references to George Thomas, who's of course a famous Virginian Union general, but it's really seen as or shown as an anomalous case, and there's almost no reference to Unionists at all in that series. So that's my short answer, is that I'd like to see some treatment of that. because it's a very important element of the conflict, and that has, in the last several decades, really since the documentary, has really complicated the picture of Confederate national loyalty by showing that this is really not an inevitable situation if you're a white Southerner. That there is a choice there. It's a hard choice, there's no doubt about it, but there is a choice there. But I think more broadly speaking, and what I found in my research that sort of ties into this is the original documentary really kind of stops quite abruptly at the end of the war and doesn't go into Reconstruction at all. And I think that reflects the way most Americans are taught about the war, that they're really there's a huge gulf between Reconstruction and the Civil War in people's minds. And I think that is a big problem. I think it is probably the Reconstruction is the single most important, single least understood element of American history. And I think a new Civil War documentary would have to treat Reconstruction, because you cannot understand subsequent American history if you stop the discussion of the Civil War at Appomattox. It fundamentally obscures very important truths about the era, especially that the ground lost in terms of Black civil rights, Black suffrage. I mean, it fails if you stop discussing the Civil War in 1865. Then Jim Crow, the onset of Jim Crow, doesn't make any sense. And if you stop it at 1865 with this triumphalist, emancipationist narrative, which that documentary does, it can leave you with a lot more questions about how the subsequent course of American history, because it doesn't make sense if it ends on this high note instead of the one step forward, two steps back, which really Reconstruction represents in American history. And I think Southern Unionists tell this story really, really well, because they view the saving of the Union and the securing of Black civil rights as utterly distinct causes. They with the Union secure, Southern Unionists are some of the most important, ultimately, and this is something I hadn't gotten a chance to talk about, really important elements of affecting what was called redemption, the restoration of democratic rule, one-party rule, and Black disenfranchisement in the South is in many ways affected by, or is sealed by, these white Unionists who view their job of saving the Union as accomplished and couldn't really care less what happened to emancipated people, free people afterwards. And I think that's a key. I think one of the big issues with the original documentary is it leaves that unexplained, the sort of the ground lost during Reconstruction in terms of Black civil rights, which lets Americans feel good about, mission accomplished, really, when of course we know that that's not the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Clayton, thank you so much for taking some of your afternoon to do this. I want to let everybody know who will be seeing this interview this summer that Dr. Butler will be joining us for a happy hour on Thursday, October 6th. So watch this. You have time to get the book. Come up with your own questions for Dr. Butler. There it is again.
There it is, yeah.
And we will see you again in October.
Thank you very much. Really
Thank
appreciate it.
you.